He's going to talk today about the new Cold War information policy and political rift. I read the description of this idea of a new Cold War. It's nothing like the old Cold War, except the use of the term. So I'm hanging in there waiting to hear about this new Cold War and what makes it cold, what makes it war, and what makes it new. But we'll see. So Phil, with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Monroe. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm excited about presenting material today because I have a new book coming out, so I'm going to air a little bit of that material. But my main project for the day is to speak about this Cold War metaphor and how I think it can be meaningfully used to understand what's going on now, particularly in authoritarian regimes where dictators tend to do public policy that privileges broadcast media, and civil society actors tend to do their creative work online. This is the new Cold War, and actually the argument, what I'm going to show you today, stems from a series of op-eds, exchanges I've had with Anne-Marie Slaughter, formerly of the State Department, about whether the metaphor fits to describe what's happening now, particularly in Russia and China, or what parts of it make the most sense. So I'm airing this with you, and perhaps our Q&A can be dedicated to telling me how it does work, how it doesn't work. And of course, many of you have country expertise different from mine, and I would love to know if the metaphor does or doesn't apply in the contexts you know. So let me start off with the big picture question that animates a lot of my research today. I'm interested in how media, information, and telecom policy has an impact on civic engagement. Now, I started off as a grad student working on this question in the American context. I did an ethnography of the Gore and the Bush campaigns in 2000, followed them around, wrote a book. The natural progression from there was to study authoritarian regimes. So overseas I went, fieldwork in Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Tanzania, more recently Tunisia, Russia. And of the plausible answers to this question, how does media, information, and telecom policy impact civic engagement? The ones that are most interesting to me are the plausible answers that involve changes in democratic processes that aren't about rapid regime change. Most of us, when we study, particularly traditional political scientists, when we study democratization, democratic change, we tend to spend most of our time interested in the rapid revolutions, the things that happen in the space of 2 weeks, the rapid changes that involve a dictator who's either dead or out of the country or hiding, gone to hiding. That is not, I believe, among the most interesting forms of democratization or even the most common. There is a deeper process of democratic entrenchment that happens amongst a larger set of countries when technologies diffuse at very rapid rates. Now, you're going to hear me use some of the strongest causal language you'll ever hear a social science use when talking about technology diffusion and political change. I'm going to justify my use of the strong causal language by also giving you a quickie methods primer on fuzzy set logic, the method I use to study to find answers to this question. I have 3 projects going now. Probably the most active is the Digital Activism Research Project funded by USIP. It's an attempt to build an event database of online civic engagement projects with public policy goals. They're not all about deposing a dictator. They're about improving taxation systems, figuring out who's in prison and why, and whether they're actually still physically in prison. They're about state capacity building transparency in developing countries. The project on information technology and political Islam is probably the one I've spent the most time on in the last couple of years. And the Digital World Information Access Project is a team of scholars working on ways to measure inequality in information societies. This was the book I wrote about Gore and Bush. And as part of the ethnographic work, I think the key punchline from this work was that in 2000, perhaps less so today, in the year 2000, there was a surprisingly small cohort of technology professionals who worked for both Gore and Bush. They worked for other groups you'd think would have nothing to do with each other, the NRA, the NAACP, the Sierra Club, groups you'd think would have no overlapping policy agenda, all relied on the same 20, 25 guys, they were all guys, often Princeton, poli-sci undergrads who wanted to build a .com but have something to do with democracy. They moved to DC to start some projects. They wanted to save American politics using information technology. After this election, the 2000 election, several of the characters involved in these political startups went overseas to work for other politicians, not all in other democracies. The way the consulting industry works, the big money is in a presidential year, right? That's when you get the big money to do creative projects. And then you go to Australia, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, you go to Europe, you come back in time for the next presidential election. And in between those big money years, you spend time working for politicians you might not normally support, but who pay the consulting bills. And several of the characters went to work for politicians, political figures in countries that don't spend a lot of time on democratic practices, but do spend money on trying to look democratic. One of the things I argued in the digital origins of dictatorship is that several of the things an authoritarian leader can do to try to build democracy involves building the capacity of the state to be responsive to citizens. Now again, I'm going to do a little bit of beating up on traditional large N ways of handling political science questions. When we study political change in the developing world, we tend to be interested in executive turnover, right? This is the classic variable in the Polity4 database. You either want to know whether the leader is still there or not, and that is one of the outcome measures we tend to work with. As a primer on my method, let me set up two contrasting images for ways of playing with data about technology diffusion and democratization. Now, the traditional way, for those of you who've suffered through a stats class, is to splay out your data, create some indices. This is technology diffusion. It's a combination of mobile phones, IP addresses, computers. It's a set of technology digital media indicators. And the Polity4 indicator of how democratic a country is, right? It's a fairly simple index. And the instinct for a traditional social scientist is to imagine the trend line. Right? The work of quantitative social science then becomes explaining why there are no cases, real cases, on the trend line. Right? The work becomes modeling the distance, right? The explained variation, the distance between the observed cases and your theoretically interesting trend line. And you throw more variables in, right? This is technology diffusion alone. You throw other things in. Wealth, the distribution of wealth, whether it's an oil state. There's a set of variables we commonly test. It's very rare in democratization studies to get an explained variation of more than 35%, which means that 60, 70, depending on your scale, 60% of the explained variation is covered by things not in your model at all. So rather than trying to fit real countries to a theoretically imagined trend line, I imagine membership in a theoretically interesting set. Fuzzy logic is a method of taking real cases, evaluating their membership in a theoretically interesting set, and then trying to figure out what sensible causal mechanisms might have put a country there. Now, this graphic has 75 countries on it. They're all countries with significant Muslim communities in them. I chose this as sort of conservatively because I was interested in countries where elites might be choosing information technologies specifically for social control, right? Not so much for economic reasons. And one of the other nice things about doing fuzzy set logic is that it forces a researcher to justify the labels associated with each of your variables. So for me, the best example, or the good instance of a democracy that has grown stronger over time is not so much the United States or Scandinavian countries. It would be Turkey or Malaysia, perhaps Indonesia, perhaps Bangladesh. For my country, my comparison set of 75 countries with significant Muslim populations, I'm more interested in indexing change to the best instances. The best instances in this particular study are Turkey, Malaysia. Fuzzy set logic also forces researchers to choose the worst instances of their cases. So fully out of the set of theoretically interesting countries are Tajikistan, right? Perhaps Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, countries that we probably wouldn't expect to see much technology diffusion or much democratization over the last 15 years. And then the tough work becomes processing the middle cases. Cases where perhaps the courts are running more smoothly than ever before, but the dictator is still basically in charge and dipping into the public purse. Right? These gray area cases of countries that are almost fully out and countries that share some attributes in common with Turkey, Malaysia. Now, when I add in other variables, you imagine your Venn diagrams, right? The set of good instances grows smaller and smaller. And then essentially, I did not go to all 75 countries. I went to a handful that I can speak about intelligently. In a sense, this is a kind of meta-analysis, because I rely on the area expertise of the scholars who have studied in each country and made either strong causal arguments for the connection between technology diffusion and political change, or the absence of a connection. Now, to boil it down, I'm going to give you the recipes for democratization that cover the period 95, right, the year the internet was privatized effectively, 95 to 2010, this was before the Arab Spring. The software boils down to a set of, a parsimonious set of causal explanations, and you're going to see two kinds of numbers. You're going to see the variable along with the percentage of coverage, the number of cases covered by this recipe, the number of ways in which, the degree to which the countries are consistent with the recipe. Now, as part of adopting a strong a strong causal frame for describing the connection between technology diffusion and democratization, I'm going to start speaking of recipes and ingredients. For me, the key thing is to find the parsimonious set of ingredients that have the best coverage. And lucky for my career, the parsimonious set of causal ingredients includes media in almost every setting. I'm going to speak of two kinds of causes for these recipes: sufficient and necessary causes. A cause is necessary if it's present in all instances of the outcome. This, for a variety of reasons, is the easiest one to measure. Sufficiency is the tougher one to discuss, and I think analytically the more important one. So these are the necessary and sufficient causes of democratization over the last 15 years for the rapid change. Right? I spoke of two ways of thinking of democratization: rapid transition, right, regime collapse, and entrenchment, young democracies getting better at doing democratic things. Yeah, Joe. Yeah.
Could you explain what you mean by the little things of democracy? I'm not sure.
Sorry, the little things of...
What is democracy in this model?
Do that quickly. Do that quickly? Yeah, I do that. Yeah.
Quickly, right?
Yeah.
But I can't understand the model unless you...
Sure, certainly. The democratization score, so I use the Polity 4 data, and it is based on executive turnover, transparency in the courts, party competition, electoral competition. It's based on some measure of policy responsiveness, some count of civil society actors within the state. So it's an index. It's a composite of other indices.
From a Western perspective.
from a Western perspective. And this is a nice way of introducing another methodology note, which I think is I want to sell fuzzy set logic to everybody. Because this index is composed from a Western perspective, I can take a kind of post-positive approach and change the data when I don't like it. Now, that's going to get some smirks, but let me explain. When you say this data comes from a Western perspective, there's real meat to that accusation, because everyone who knows this particular data set knows that the analysts have been too generous on Singapore and too generous on Russia for the last 10 years, Singapore for the last 25 years of the scale. The reason is that Singapore is authoritarian, but they're capitalist, right? This is what the critique has emerged. So Singapore has been graded fairly well, perhaps a bit more generously than they should have, and that is a reason why I downgraded Singapore's democracy score. Same with Russia. The analysts have been fairly generous to Russia's democracy rating for the last 10 years. I lowered the score because I have the scholarship to back me up to say that, as you rightly ask, that the democracy things they're talking about aren't quite meaningful in this particular context. So that's the outcome. That's the thing I'm trying to explain. Having an active civil society online has been particularly important for the rapid regime change in the last 15 years. And of the necessary causes, there are a couple ways to process necessary causes of democratization. One is to look for the best single variable, in this case being a small country. Small countries seem to change more rapidly than the larger ones. But analytically, that's not as useful. The best possible nugget for me in this kind of analysis is what we call a conjoined causal set. A set of factors that together explain most of the transitions over the last 15 years. And as a conjoined causal combination, again, it's having a wired civil society, having civic groups able to raise money, deliver services, stay independent of the state, maintain their own media identity. That's crucial for democratization, for this rapid transition recipe. Let me do the recipe now for entrenchment. The answer is slightly different for entrenchment, right? Entrenchment is young democracies getting better, deepening democratic institutions. It's not so much having wired journalists, an online public sphere with journalists doing their creative work. It's not so much about having party competition online. It's actually about having a wired state. That is, a state with the informational capacity to keep track of its citizens, to collect and dispense taxes, to keep the national budgets on an Excel spreadsheet. These basic state capacity factors seem to be amongst the most important causal ingredients for the entrenchment recipe. Having a wired state and not being dependent on fuel resources, right? That's a common one for these kinds of solutions. So in a sense, it's actually nice that this analysis sort of maps on to what the traditional modeling finds. Having a fuel-dependent economy, as you can expect, lets you buy off local elites, lets you pay for a good military, lets you resist institutional change. Again, the best nugget here is the necessary, not the single necessary cause, but the conjoined causal combination. Not having an economy dependent on fuel wealth, having a state with decent information infrastructure, and having a relatively well-educated population. Please.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you a Jill-like question. When you're talking about democratic transition, is that going from lowest level to somewhat mid-level? Is it going from an authoritarian to a hybrid or somewhat democratic? And is the democratic entrenchment going from a hybrid to the highest? Is that what you mean?
It was formally defined as a 6-point change in the index, so a very significant change in the space of a year or less. There were 1 or 2 cases where there were 6-point changes in the wrong direction. For analytical purposes, I toss out countries that wouldn't teach us much about democratization. So Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan, they're in the set of countries with significant Muslim populations, but I dropped them from the analysis because they aren't that relevant.
So what's the difference between democratic transition and democratic entrenchment?
Entrenchment is a young democracy, an emerging democracy that moves slowly over the course of several years. The rapid regime transition is something fast, within a year, significant. Usually involves a dictator dying or a revolution of some sort. Or it involves a set of activities like the Arab Spring. Right? A peculiar event, I think, in which a set of inspiring images, digital artifacts, cascade over international boundaries, setting off protest in multiple countries within the space of 2 weeks, 3 weeks. This is Democracy's Fourth Wave, forthcoming from Oxford, should be out in another few weeks. And as many of you may find, the inspiration for this is actually bad journalism. It was an essay I read in The Economist. Nothing gets me started faster than journalists that don't get it right. A simple index of what they called the causal factors behind the Arab Spring. They indexed the countries involved, measuring press freedom, corruption, democracy, wealth, the age of the population, all relevant factors in different ways. They excluded the media. Right? The technology diffusion was not, digital media diffusion was not part of the analytical frame here. And the countries they seek to explain are actually not the ones we think of as good examples of what the Arab Spring was about. So Tunisia and Egypt appear further down the list. Yemen was actually Libya, locked in civil war for an extended period, right? Iraq, not really a good example of an Arab Spring country. To some degree, certainly Egypt is, Oman, and the countries where the dictator, the ruling elite stayed in charge, but there were significant concessions, right? Those sort of gray area in a fuzzy logic kind of way. Those countries, Jordan, Morocco, don't really appear. So again, using this traditional set of variables doesn't seem to explain the set of changes that, the set of popular uprisings we saw in the Arab Spring. So what might have made some regimes more susceptible than others to popular uprisings 2 years ago? What might explain the relative success of some movements over others? And what role does information technology have in this recipe for democratization? These are the four clowns, right? The four characters who lost their jobs, and one of them lost their life 2 years ago. The solution set, I won't walk through the consistency and coverage scores again, but the solution set gives some good symmetrical, I think, allocation of cases to the different plausible explanations. Again, so this uses youth, youth bulge, youth unemployment, regular unemployment, wealth, a set of factors. The two that seemed most important for most of the outcomes was whether or not the country had significant fuel wealth, standard explanation, and whether or not citizens in that country were using digital media in creative ways, either during the organization phase of the protest or in those 2 or 3 years leading up, the 2 or 3 years of background activism that turns out to be very important for social movement success. And the spread of countries makes sense, right? Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, countries locked in extended civil war. Morocco, Lebanon, Tunisia, either quick changes or significant policy concessions fairly early on. Bahrain, Libya, Saudi Arabia, where the state puts its full military capacity against the civil unrest and crushes things quickly, or in the case of Libya, tries very hard to crush things quickly. Having the fuel wealth can counteract this democratization recipe that seems to have such strong explanatory power for the last 15 years. Now, remember, I'm not explaining political revolution before the internet. This is just the last 15 years with the democratization. Now, the Arab Spring is particularly interesting because I think it set up this situation of what I think is now a kind of Cold War. A situation in which not only did activists learn about how each other was using digital media in creative ways, but a situation in which the dictators learned too, right? Authoritarian regimes over the course of the Arab Spring figured out some tricks. They learned from the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. Dictators rely on a small community of technically proficient policymakers who fly from Tehran to Caracas and back to Moscow to teach them about what good censorship policy looks like. They apply these information censorship strategies. They develop digital counterinsurgency strategies, right? Capturing people on Facebook to round them up physically, pretending to be activists so that you can tap into the network. They copy media regulations from other bad examples of what a media regulatory regime can be, and they do these clumsy attempts at social media, right? This is the 50 Cent Army thing, the cyber troopers, the Basiji militias who blog in Iran. Almost every regime now has a counterinsurgency strategy because almost every civil society group has a creative online strategy. Yeah.
Is there any proof that an actual coordinated network of expertise exists? That's a great question.
There are journalists who've who've named the folks who do fly between these capital cities. They're not organized in the way that that democracy advocates have their formally State Department funded meetings, right? But there is an open market for what are called zero-day vulnerabilities, right? The secrets in a state's information infrastructure you don't talk about until the day you need them, right? So there is a known market for that information. It's a tough network to study.
An O-Day network is different from saying that there's actually people that fly from Caracas to Tehran,
Right.
Like teaching about like how to build a censorship network.
Right. It is, but the knowledge group is the same. The set of people who go, they're mostly Moscow-based, and they help the Central Asian countries. They check in with what the Iranians do, and any country that tries to build its own national internet, you know, as Iran or North Korea might talk about doing, relies on the technologies that have been developed for Venezuela, Cuba, and Russia.
Do you have references to this?
Yes, I'm happy to share. I'm happy to help you Google them. Yeah. So let me start off with my 4 cases. I want to talk a little bit about Russia. I want to take you back to Tunisia, take you to China, and then talk about the ITU to set up this Cold War metaphor. The fellow on the left was Putin's nominee for the office of a youth commissioner in the Ministry of Information, Information and Cultural Affairs. He had a particular opinion on the Pussy Riot events this summer. The woman on the left is the target of his outrage. She was a free speech activist, a Pussy Riot activist on the streets of Moscow about a year ago. Somebody caught the event with their mobile phone camera, took this single snap, sent it to The Guardian. Story comes around, the guy is not able to take his job. His name comes off the nomination list. In a sense, this is a story you've probably all heard from different kinds of countries because it's a story that involves digital media embarrassing a political candidate. It's also familiar in the story in the sense that the impact wasn't lasting, right? Eventually, this guy got another job in the regime. And almost all the stories of the creative use of digital media in authoritarian countries have these sort of two-sided outcomes. This is another story from Russia, again with the double-sided outcomes. The Russian government decided for its last election, last March, that there would be webcams in every polling station in the country. Spent hundreds of thousands of dollars wiring up these polling stations, putting cameras, capturing the video. All of it went to an online archive. Within 2 weeks or so, just before the election, the national elections administrators decided that video evidence of fraud would not be admissible. So the state rolled out this massive technology program and then decided that it wouldn't do with any of the wisdom generated by the whatever was captured on video. The archive still went live, right? So a few democracy advocates actually watched significant chunks of time. And this looks funny, but it's not funny to Russians particularly. These are people voting over and over again. This woman comes back multiple times. I'll just let it run because there's nothing interesting here. This is the highlight reel. This is 15 minutes from different polling stations around the country. At one point, you'll see the administrator get up and vote. Like it'll become nighttime and you'll see him get up and vote several times. For Russians, there is nothing interesting about this highlight reel because it is part of what they experience when they run an election, right? This time, however, there's some documentation. Nothing came of it in the sense that Putin's still in charge. There was not a significant regime change. But after the election, the cameras were redistributed to local administrators who have started using the cameras to track construction projects that don't seem to make any progress, right? So they do this now live tracking to see when the cranes are actually moving, when things are actually being built. This infrastructure was rolled out by the state, not used, but then got repurposed in a way unexpected by the regime. So, as I said, most of these good stories of digital activism from authoritarian regimes have these two outcomes. Situations in which somebody does something creative, the state tries to ignore it. Somebody else does something creative. Let me take you to Tunisia. Let me say how I think Russia fits into this Cold War. And one of the ways, all due respect to Monroe, one of the ways in which I think the Cold War metaphor works is that some of the country alliances are the same. It's no longer about military institutions and military alignments, but media alignments and the techniques of learning that seem to come by the folks who teach others how to use technology for creativity or social control. It's still an alignment that involves Russia and China, and Vietnam, and Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, North Korea. That set of countries is still very much the source of social control applications. The West, the United States, seems to be the source of most of the democracy advocates projects. Russia has become a case where the cold media war is raging. The handling of the Pussy Riot trial and election monitoring cameras exemplifies how ruling elites use instruments of broadcast for social control and wherever possible, reconfigure public policy to undermine whatever creative stuff might be happening online. They work very hard to constrain the use of social media and invest significant state resources in the media they know how to control, broadcast. Let me take you to Tunisia. This is also a story you'll know well from the Arab Spring. It involves both Tunisia and to some degree Egypt, right? A citizen who suffered at the hands of security services. The assaults themselves weren't documented with digital media, but the pictures of Bouazizi lying burnt, wrapped in bandages in his hospital bed were circulated by friends and family and did become a news story when the national media wouldn't cover it, wouldn't treat it as a news story. 10 days, 2 weeks after the incident, which he set himself on fire, Ben Ali was forced to go to this hospital bed and appear on national TV to be visiting the victim. There's plenty of rumors that he had passed away at this point, but they kept him in the room for the media event. Khaled Said experienced something similar. The assaults were not documented digitally, but pictures of him in the morgue were, and they are what circulated. There's almost always a story of success or torment that triggers the particular revolution, particular uprisings in each country. In Tunisia's case, it was this incident. But before Bouazizi was set on fire, Tunisia was still among the countries with the most creative citizen journalism, because journalists were not able to publish their stuff online, were not able to publish their stuff in country. And Tunisia was among the countries with the most creative video applications of investigative journalism. This is a straightforward video, crowdsourced in an interesting way. As you may know, there's train spotters, right? There's also plane spotters, these folks who sit at the end of runways and take snaps of planes taking off, landing at each airport. One guy put together a simple video. This is Google Earth, right? It's jerky, it's free, not particularly sophisticated. I could play the music, but it's awful. He assembled photos of planes landing, taking off, and the itinerary of the president's plane in Tunisia. The Tunisian president's plane, known to have one occupant at the time, the president's wife. She was going on a European shopping tour, and he managed to assemble her complete itinerary from Malta to Paris, Europe's great shopping centers, and back to Tunis. Not something the national media would cover, but an excellent example of the kind of investigative journalism we see now from people who are not formally trained as journalists. There's some critique we could make about their products. But I would argue that as much as the images of Ben Ali visiting Bouazizi in the bed, this 3, 4, 5-year story prior to the uprising that involves digital media used in creative ways to undermine the credibility of the regime, that's an important part of the democratization story. So for me, the Arab Spring is not so much interesting because of the logistics, the on-the-ground logistics of protest coordination, but the long-term erosion of regime credibility that seems to happen mostly online. Tunisia is a case where the tide has turned. Civic actors use digital media with great ingenuity impact in terms of fragility and movement success. But again, there's been some failures. There was talk of a digital constitution, right? They were going to produce a constitution through a wiki. Didn't happen. Civil society networks were strong, but they didn't actually turn into political parties, right? Same thing happened in Egypt. Civic networks can be vibrant online, but at some point they need to translate into political parties to compete, and there may not be many good examples from the Arab Spring of that process happening successfully. Now in government, the Muslim Brotherhood makes effective use of broadcast media, right? So now in charge, they would, as a group, they were once incredibly creative online, managing their organization's finances and logistics online. They don't have to do that now, and they marshal the resources of state media to support their political cause. In the interest of time, I'm going to go quickly over the last 2 cases. Actually, I'm going to go quickly into the ITU, and we can return to China if we'd like. As you may have been following in the media, there's an open international debate now over who can or should control the internet. And I think most of the diplomats, most of the political actors involved are fully aware that these are essentially private networks, right, or perhaps publicly traded companies, but private digital information infrastructure over which they can't exert a lot of political power. But that doesn't mean that the international forum for having a multilateral conversation about turning the internet into a global tool for social control can't happen, right? The forum is still there, and so different governments have tried to make this argument at the ITU. ICANN, the standard setting process for the technologies we know and love, is not as effective at helping maintain much of a censorship strategy unless a state is willing to build kill switches and invest in the significant censorship software you need to track everything. There have been several different kinds of strategies for turning the internet into a tool for social control. Perhaps the most effective ones are the ones that don't involve software, but involve culture. They're the ones that involve teaching a generation of internet users to submit URLs that they find offensive. This is what the Saudis did, right? From the very beginning, you could nominate a URL for something you found offensive to the Ministry of Culture and Communications, and they would ban it for you. As a result, the Saudi Arabian internet using population is one that concurs with the ways in which state manages information. It's part of their technology use culture. I believe the Russians and the Venezuelans are trying to do something similar, to rewire their public sphere online to get more cultural buy-in to the notion that the state should oversee conversations. Ultimately, the ITU becomes the target for Russian anger about Western democracy advocates, because it's the forum that might be able to embarrass the United States, embarrass the degree to which the American industries, American firms, aren't able to comply with what foreign governments ask of them in every circumstance. The battles are between broadcast media outlets and social media upstarts. These two kinds of organizations, kinds of firms, kinds of civic groups, have very different approaches to news production, ownership, and censorship. And here's sort of the core ways in which I think the Cold War metaphor may apply. As a definition, I'd offer this: a sustained period in the next few years where there's global tension over media alliances, telecom policy, and technology standards. Increasingly, international forum will be used as ways of building alliances, right? Building out media ecologies that are essentially incompatible or competing. These alliances will be based on alignments of information policy and censorship policy. There'll be peripheral flare-ups of surprising impacts on global affairs. That is, countries where these civic upstarts seem to be doing more creative work than political elites may be the most likely ones to disrupt, if we buy the recipe for democratization from the last 15 years. The alliances are familiar. Russia, China, other authoritarian regimes make heavy investments in broadcast media, censorship infrastructure, and online propaganda. The West is the source of the online civic projects. And increasingly, it's Western governments, right? There have been multiple governments have committed millions of dollars to building applications for getting around firewalls, applications for networking activists, and even setting up physical meetings, physical spaces for people to get together, to meet and network and trade stories of success and failure. Here's some of the mechanics, I think, of what this Cold War, how this Cold War will be organized in the next few years. We'll see increasing ideological differences in the coalitions of technology standards, so the ways in which people agree to let the internet operate, or the ways in which political leaders decide to bound their internets nationally. Of the Bushisms that actually make sense, right? The Bushisms that we're left with that make sense, this notion of the internets, of most distinct subnetworks of information infrastructure, this is the one that I think explains what the Cold War will result in over the next few years. Distinct subcultures of technology use. Core governments will provide aid to client states. For the most part, that's the United States, providing infrastructure as aid. For the deployment of preferred technologies, increasingly corporate espionage and government espionage are blurred, right, as distinct categories. It's difficult to tell what the difference is, especially when the Chinese do it. There are massive propaganda campaigns about intellectual property and IP law. This rivalry through cultural policy and preferred media with state-backed races to dominate consumer electronics will result increasingly in sub-fears of media consumption, information access. And like the Cold War, it's hard to envision the resolution of events. It's hard to imagine how the ITU could actually reconcile these competing expectations for intellectual property law. It's hard to imagine, now I think that we're in it, it's hard to imagine a totally free global internet that, maybe John Perry Barlow imagined. It's hard to imagine a fully collapsed set of national internets that really don't engage much with each other. So these, I think, are the key aspects of what I'd call a media Cold War. And let me end there and open it up. Thanks for your attention. I'd love to know what you think. Thank you.